They laughed at him, of course. They always did. When Harold Jenkins pulled up to the farmyard with that rusted hulk of metal rattling in the back of his pickup, half the town seemed to have something to say about it. The thing looked like it had been dragged from the bottom of a river. Dented corners, a door that wouldn't close all the way, its faded paint eaten away by years of neglect. "Gonna keep your potato harvest in there, Harold?" Someone called from the porch of O'Malley's diner. "Better hope there ain't tetanus inside." Another chuckled. Harold just smiled, the quiet, stubborn kind of smile that told people he wasn't listening, even when he was. He was 52, a farmer by habit if not by choice, the kind of man who measured time by harvests and debts. His fields were tired, his hands cracked from years of work that barely kept the lights on. Since his wife passed, the house had grown quieter, emptier. Some nights, he left the TV on just to hear another voice. The safe had come from an estate auction on the far side of the county, the kind of event where people came to gawk at the ruins of someone else's life. The auctioneer had practically begged bidders to take it away. "Rust bucket," one man had muttered. "Ain't no use left in that thing." But something about it had stopped Harold in his tracks. Maybe it was the way it sat apart from everything else, heavy and silent, as if guarding its own dignity. The tag read simply, "Lot 42, metal safe, contents unknown." He hadn't planned to buy anything that day. He'd only gone to help a neighbor load an old plow. But when the auctioneer started at $20 and no one raised a hand, Harold felt a strange pull in his chest, an impulse that didn't come from reason. "20, he said quietly. The gavel came down before anyone else could think to laugh. Now, as he backed his truck into the barn, the safe thudded against the tailgate with each bump. Rust flaked off in red streaks like dried blood. Harold cut the engine and sat for a long moment, staring at it through the drizzle that had begun to fall. It wasn't just curiosity. There was something else in the air, something about that safe that felt alive. When he finally climbed out and lowered the tailgate, the hinges screamed like a warning. He wrapped his hands around the cold steel and tried to shift it, but it didn't budge. The thing must have weighed close to 500 pounds. Under the weak light spilling from the barn rafters, he noticed something strange. Faint scratches near the handle, like someone had tried to pry it open recently. He crouched closer. The marks were clean, fresh silver against the orange rust. Someone else had wanted in. But why had they given up? Harold ran his fingers along the edges of the door, feeling the chill of the metal seep into his skin. His heart began to hammer in that slow, unsettling way it did when he knew he was standing too close to something that mattered, something that might just change everything. He exhaled, whispering to himself, "What are you hiding, old girl?" As the rain drummed harder on the roof, a flicker of lightning illuminated the safe, and for an instant, he could swear he saw a faint engraving beneath the grime. A single word, barely visible under decades of decay. He wiped at it with his sleeve, squinting. The letters spelled a name. McLennan. Harold froze. That name hadn't been spoken in these parts for nearly 60 years. But he remembered it. Everyone did. And as thunder rolled across the valley, he realized that he hadn't just bought an old safe. He'd brought home the last remaining piece of a story the town had tried very hard to forget. By morning, the rain had turned the fields into a sea of mud. Harold woke before dawn, as always, brewed his bitter coffee, and stood by the window watching the gray sky swallow the hills. He told himself he had work to do. The east fence was still half collapsed, and the cattle hadn't been fed since yesterday's storm. But his eyes kept drifting to the barn, to the safe. It sat there in the half-dark like a sleeping animal, massive and mute. After breakfast, he gave in. He pulled on his boots, grabbed a crowbar, and stepped into the cold. The barn smelled of wet hay and oil. The safe was where he'd left it, rust dusting the floor around it like red snow. He set the crowbar against the door's seam and pried, but the steel didn't budge. The lock, though corroded, held firm, a black iron dial with numbers half erased by time. "Stubborn thing," he muttered. He worked the crowbar again, harder this time, until the metal screamed and the vibration shot up his arms. Nothing. Then, as he straightened to catch his breath, something clinked against the floor. A small, metallic sound, soft but deliberate. Harold froze. It had come from beneath the safe. He crouched and peered under it. A small object glinted faintly in the dust, half buried, barely visible. He slid his hand under the edge, fingers scraping against the cold floor, and drew it out. It was a key. Old-fashioned, brass, shaped like the kind used in bank vaults a century ago. The teeth were worn smooth, and the bow was engraved with the same name he'd seen on the safe's door, McLennan. A chill swept through him. He hadn't noticed the key yesterday, couldn't have, not with how dark it was. But there it was now, as if it had been waiting for him to return. He stood motionless for a long while, the key glinting in his palm, rain whispering on the tin roof above. That name, McLennan, had once belonged to the wealthiest family in the county. Old money, old secrets. They'd owned the grain mill, half the land by the river, even the general store. Then, in the spring of 1962, the youngest son vanished. People said he'd run off after the bank collapse, taking what he could. Others said he'd died, an accident, a robbery gone wrong. But no one had ever found the body, or the missing money. And now Harold was holding a safe with the McLennan name stamped into it. He ran his thumb over the key's grooves. It was too perfect a fit for coincidence. Heart hammering, he crouched beside the safe and slid the key toward the lock. It didn't fit there, not quite. The safe had a dial, not a keyhole. But as he traced the edges with his fingers, he noticed something he'd missed before. A small rectangular plate, bolted just above the hinge, slightly misaligned. He wedged the crowbar under it and pried gently. The plate shifted with a groan, revealing a hidden keyhole beneath, sealed with grime. Harold's breath caught. He slid the key in. It resisted, then turned with a click that echoed through the barn like a gunshot. The dial spun loosely now, the tumblers falling into place with mechanical precision. Then, silence. He gripped the handle and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low metallic sigh, the door creaked open an inch, then two, the hinges shrieking as they gave way. The smell that hit him was a mix of metal, dust, and something older, a dry, cold scent like stone sealed away from sunlight. Inside, he saw only darkness. He reached for his flashlight on the workbench, flicked it on, and aimed it inside. At first, all he saw were shapes, wooden boxes, a stack of old papers, what looked like a small ledger bound in cracked leather. Then the light caught something else. A photograph, lying face up on top of a folded cloth. It was black and white, the image faint but clear enough to make out two men standing in front of what looked like the McLennan estate. One of them, tall, narrow-faced, wearing a long coat, Harold recognized from an old newspaper clipping he'd seen decades ago. Daniel McLennan, the missing son. But the man beside him. Harold's heart stuttered. He knew that face. Older now, softer with time, but unmistakable. It was his father. And beneath the photograph, the corner of an envelope peeked out, sealed with wax that bore the same emblem as the key. Harold set down the flashlight, his hands trembling. The laughter of the town echoed in his memory, the voices mocking him for dragging home a useless piece of junk. But he wasn't laughing now, because somehow, this rusted safe had just reached across 60 years and dragged his family's name into a story he didn't yet understand. Harold sat at his workbench, the open safe yawning behind him like a wound. The photograph trembled in his hand. His father, standing beside Daniel McLennan. It made no sense. His father had never spoken of the McLennans, never mentioned working for them, never even passed near that part of town when Harold was a boy. He'd been a quiet man, too quiet, keeping his words locked up the same way the safe had kept its secrets. Harold set the photo aside and picked up the envelope beneath it. The wax seal crumbled beneath his thumb. Inside were several folded sheets of yellowed paper, written in an elegant, slanted hand. The first line froze his blood. "If you are reading this, then I have failed to set things right." He read on. The writer, Daniel McLennan himself, spoke of debts, of betrayal, and of a sum of money that had disappeared when the family business collapsed. But it wasn't theft, he insisted. It was insurance. I did not take it for greed, but to protect what is left of our name. The others would destroy it all to save themselves. Further down, one sentence was underlined twice. The man who helped me hide it knows what to do when the time comes. No name, no location, just that. Harold's breath hitched. The man who helped me hide it. He looked again at the photograph. His father's eyes, solemn, unsmiling, seemed to stare straight through the decades. What had he helped hide? He rifled through the safe again. Beneath the papers lay a small wooden box, about the size of a loaf of bread. It was lighter than he expected. Inside were two items, a tarnished pocket watch and a folded map. The watch had initials etched on the back, DM. The map, though faint with age, showed the outskirts of town and a mark drawn in red ink near the river bend. Harold stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. He knew that place. It was less than 2 miles from his farm, a spot his father used to visit alone every spring, saying only that it was for clearing his head. But now, Harold realized, his father hadn't gone there to think. He'd gone there to remember, and maybe, to guard something no one else was supposed to find. The morning mist hung thick over the fields as Harold steered his pickup down the narrow dirt road. The map lay unfolded on the seat beside him, the red mark circled just above the bend of Miller's River, a place most folks avoided since the floods years back. His father used to walk there on Sundays, boots muddy, hat low, coming home with silence in his eyes. Harold had never followed. Until now. The truck jolted over ruts and stones before the trees opened to reveal the river, calm, dark, and slow. The air smelled of moss and wet earth. Birds were silent, as if the world were holding its breath. He parked under a leaning oak and stepped out, boots sinking into the mud. The map had shown an old boundary line that no longer existed, but there, between the roots, he saw a faint mound, unnaturally shaped. Not earth, not rock. He knelt, brushed away leaves. Wood. An old crate, its corners eaten by time, buried halfway into the riverbank. His pulse quickened. The crowbar in his hand suddenly felt heavier than steel. He pried at the lid. The nails groaned. The wood splintered. The smell of damp and rot filled the air. Inside, beneath layers of oilcloth, something glinted. Bundles, small, wrapped tight in cloth. He pulled one free, unwrapped it slowly. Money. Old bills, crisp despite the years, sealed in waxed paper. The edges marked Federal Reserve, 1961. There were dozens of them. Harold staggered back, breath catching. This was it. The missing fortune that had ruined the McLennans, whispered about in town for half a century. But before he could process the weight of what he'd found, he noticed something else inside the crate. A small metal tag, tarnished, attached to one of the bundles. He rubbed it clean. Stamped into the surface were 2 letters, H, J, his initials. For a moment, the world tilted. The river, the trees, the air itself seemed to close in. This wasn't just Daniel McLennan's secret. It was his father's plan, one that had waited decades for him to uncover. And as the wind rippled across the dark water, Harold felt it. Not triumph, not fear, but the creeping realization that someone else might have been waiting for this discovery too. Harold loaded the crate into the truck bed, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The bills were packed tight under a tarp, the map stuffed in his jacket pocket, but the weight of it all, the history, the danger, pressed heavier than any load he'd ever carried. As he slammed the tailgate shut, something shifted in the mist behind him. A sound, soft, deliberate. He turned. Nothing but fog and the crooked silhouettes of trees. But he could feel it. That faint prickling at the base of his neck, the instinct every farmer knows when a coyote's watching from the tree-line. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice came back to him, thin and useless. The stillness after was worse than any answer. He climbed into the truck, engine sputtering to life. The tires spun in the mud before gripping, throwing water as he lurched forward. In the mirror, the fog swallowed the river bend. Halfway home, the unease didn't fade, it grew. A shadow flickered behind him once, then again. The faint glow of headlights in the distance. Too far to see who it was, too steady to be coincidence. He took the long way back through the back roads, doubling around the ridge. When he reached his driveway, the lights were gone. But he didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Inside the barn, he heaved the crate onto the floor beside the open safe. The money, the map, the photograph, it all lay before him now. The puzzle pieces of a secret too heavy for one man to hold. He pulled out his father's old ledger from a drawer, flipping through the brittle pages. Near the back, a date caught his eye. April 14th, 1962, the very week Daniel McLennan had disappeared. And beneath it, a note in his father's handwriting. Delivery complete. Keep the key safe. Only for him. For him. Harold's breath left his body in a shaky exhale. His father hadn't stumbled into this by accident. He'd been part of it. He glanced toward the barn doors. The fog outside was still thick, clinging to the glass. And there, faintly, barely visible, was the shape of a person standing just beyond the window. Watching. Harold froze. The figure outside the window didn't move, just stood there in the fog, tall, still, almost part of it. For a long, breathless moment, the only sound was the slow drip of rain from the eaves. Then the shape turned. A faint glint, maybe from a belt buckle, maybe a flashlight, flashed once, and the figure walked toward the gate. Harold's pulse thudded in his ears. He grabbed the nearest thing resembling a weapon, an old wrench from the workbench, and stepped carefully toward the door. The hinges creaked when he opened it, and the cold air hit him like a slap. No one, just fog, the yard, the faint sway of the oak branches. Then came the crunch of gravel behind him. He spun around. A man stood at the edge of the barn's lantern light, hands in his coat pockets, face shadowed beneath a hat. "Evening, Mr. Jenkins," the stranger said, his tone smooth, practiced. "You've been busy." Harold gripped the wrench tighter. "You from the county?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's say, I take interest in old property, especially the kind people shouldn't have." His gaze flicked to the opened safe, the scattered papers, the faint edges of dollar bills beneath the tarp. "Funny thing," he said softly. "That safe you bought, it wasn't supposed to leave the McLennan estate. But well, you changed that." Harold's throat went dry. "You followed me." The man stepped closer. "You led me." They stood in silence, the fog swirling between them. The stranger's hand slipped into his coat pocket, slowly, deliberately. Not a gun, Harold realized, something smaller. A photograph. He tossed it at Harold's feet. It was the same image Harold had found inside the safe. Daniel McLennan and his father. But this one had been cropped, printed fresh, the edges clean. Someone else had been searching, too. "I think," the man said quietly, "you and I are after the same thing. But only one of us gets to keep it." Before Harold could speak, the stranger turned and vanished into the fog, as silent as he'd appeared. Only the faint crunch of gravel lingered, fading into the distance. Harold stared after him, chest tight, the wrench trembling in his grip. He wasn't alone in this anymore. And whoever that man was, he'd been waiting for the safe much longer than Harold had. Harold barely slept. Every creak of the old farmhouse sent him reaching for the shotgun that leaned by the door. But the night passed without incident. No footsteps, no lights on the road. Only silence, heavy and watchful. At dawn, he found himself back in the barn, pacing circles around the open safe. The photograph the stranger had dropped lay where it had fallen, edges curling in the damp air. Same faces, same year. But someone had reprinted it, which meant someone had access to the McLennan archives. He picked up the old leather ledger again. His father's handwriting ran steady across the pages, neat and deliberate. But toward the back, the ink grew shakier. Nervous. Halfway through a page dated 1975, Harold found something that made his stomach twist. He came back asking for what's his. Told him it's not mine to give. If anything happens to me, H.J. will know where to look. He read the line 3 times before it sank in. His father had known someone was coming. Maybe the same man who'd appeared last night. He turned the page. A loose sheet fell out, folded into thirds. Inside was a note written in pencil, faint but legible. "If they find the river cache, they'll come for the rest. The second box is deeper than they'll think. Don't trust the man with the scar." Harold's pulse spiked. He could almost feel the barn watching him, every shadow suddenly too alive. He thought back to the stranger's face in the fog, the dim light catching what he'd assumed was dirt along his cheek. A scar. The wrench clattered from Harold's hand. He grabbed the map, spreading it across the workbench. The red mark he'd dug up was there, but just below it, faint pencil lines outlined a smaller X. Another location. Another box. He swore under his breath. There's more buried out there. And if his father's warning was true, that man, the one with the scar, already knew it. Harold snatched his coat and the shotgun, glancing once more at the photo before killing the lights. Whatever lay buried near that river, he wasn't the only one digging for it anymore. By noon, the fog had burned away, leaving the river valley sharp and brittle under pale sunlight. Harold parked farther up the road this time, half hidden by the hedgerow, the shotgun laid across the passenger seat. The spot marked on the map was deeper into the woods, about 50 yards from where he'd found the first crate. He moved cautiously, every twig snap echoing like a gunshot in the quiet. The earth was soft from last night's rain. Easy digging. Almost too easy. He'd been working only 15 minutes when his spade struck something solid. Wood again, but newer. The nails still clean, the edges sharp. Someone's been here recently, he muttered. He cleared the dirt with his hands, heart pounding, until the top of the box was fully exposed. Same size as before, but with one difference. This one was padlocked. And bolted into the lid was a small metal tag engraved with a number, 02. The first crate hadn't been numbered. This was deliberate. Organized. He wiped the sweat from his brow, crouching low. The lock wasn't rusted. It gleamed faintly in the light. Whoever buried this had done it not 60 years ago, but weeks. Maybe days. The crunch of footsteps froze him. He ducked behind a fallen log just as a shadow passed between the trees. The man with the scar. He was moving slowly, scanning the ground. His coat brushed with mud as if he'd been here before. He stopped only a few feet from the half-dug crate, crouched, and smiled. "Right where you left it, old man," the stranger murmured, brushing dirt from the lid. He pulled a key from his pocket and slid it into the lock. Click. Harold's hand tightened on the shotgun, but he didn't move. Not yet. The man lifted the lid and peered inside. For a heartbeat, he just stared, then laughed quietly, the sound low and hollow. "Empty," he said. "You clever bastard." He slammed the lid shut, cursing under his breath, and scanned the trees, eyes sharp, searching. Harold didn't breathe. The man's gaze lingered on the undergrowth for a moment too long. Then he straightened, pocketed the key, and walked back toward the road. Only when his footsteps vanished did Harold crawl out, heart hammering. The box was real, but whatever it had once held was gone, and now someone else was hunting what remained. When the stranger's footsteps faded into the wind, Harold crouched beside the second crate. The lock still dangled open. Inside, nothing but dirt and splinters. Yet something about the man's reaction nagged at him. That laughter hadn't been disappointment. It was recognition. He ran his fingers along the inside walls. The wood felt wrong, uneven. At the base, his nails caught on a seam. A hidden panel. He pried at it with the edge of his pocket knife until the board lifted slightly, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. His pulse quickened. Inside lay a small metal cylinder, capped at both ends with brass. Wrapped around it was a strip of waxed paper, stained with soil. He unrolled the paper carefully. Faded ink, nearly gone, but enough remained to read a few words. Vault, beneath the mill, key fragment enclosed. Beneath it, taped to the cylinder, was half of a jagged metal key, broken clean through. Harold exhaled, shaking his head. Vault beneath the mill. He knew the place, or what was left of it. The old McLennan grain mill had burned down in the 1970s. Only the foundation remained, swallowed by weeds and river silt. Locals said it was cursed ground, that nothing grew right near it anymore. He pocketed the key half and the note, then covered the crate again. As he stood, a noise rippled through the woods, a faint metallic click. A camera. He spun around. No one. Only the hiss of wind through the trees. But on a low branch nearby, tied with fishing line, hung a small trail camera, the kind hunters used to track deer. Its lens pointed straight at the clearing. His stomach dropped. The man with the scar hadn't just been searching. He'd been watching. Harold yanked the camera down, ripped out the battery, and shoved it in his coat. He didn't care about stealth anymore. He ran, half slipping in the mud, crashing through branches, until his truck came into view. As he threw the gear into reverse, a single thought pulsed through his head. The stranger wasn't trying to find the vault. He already knew where it was. He was waiting for Harold to bring him the missing piece. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of rust, same as the safe that started it all. Harold's truck rolled slowly down the overgrown path toward the ruins of the old McLennan mill. The river shimmered beside him, thin and fast now after the storms. The factory skeleton loomed ahead, black beams jutting like broken ribs against the dying light. He killed the engine and listened. Just the water, just the wind. But he'd been fooled by silence before. The ground near the mill was uneven, the soil dark and slick with oil that had seeped from the earth decades ago. Cracked concrete slabs jutted through the grass, each one stamped faintly with the McLennan family emblem, the same one carved on the safe's key. The air felt colder here. Heavy. He found a doorway half buried in vines and ducked inside. The floor was littered with charred wood and rusted machinery. Shafts of light speared through holes in the ceiling, revealing the blackened remains of gears and conveyor belts. It smelled of ash and metal and memory. The note from the false bottom echoed in his head. Vault beneath the mill. He swept his flashlight across the cracked floor until the beam caught something strange. A square outline carved into the concrete, half hidden beneath debris. A hatch. He crouched, brushed it clean, and saw the edges of an iron door, the kind that led to maintenance tunnels back when the mill still ran. A corroded handle jutted from one side. He tugged. It moved an inch before catching on something heavy below. Rust squealed as he forced it up another inch, then another. A rush of cold, stale air poured out, thick as breath. Harold coughed, leaning closer. The beam of his flashlight fell into the darkness below, revealing a narrow ladder descending into what looked like a sub-basement. He hesitated only a moment. Then he slung the shotgun over his shoulder and climbed down. The rungs were slick with rust, his boots scraping against the damp stone wall. 10 feet. 15. Then his boot touched solid ground. The air was colder than ice, and the silence so deep it pressed against his skull. He raised the flashlight. Ahead of him stretched a narrow corridor lined with steel doors, each identical, each numbered in fading paint. And at the end of the corridor, faintly illuminated by the dying beam of his light, was a door marked 03. The third box. The number 03 shimmered faintly under the flashlight's trembling beam. The rest of the corridor swallowed light like a throat. Water dripped somewhere in the dark, each drop echoing as if the tunnel itself had a pulse. Harold's breath came shallow. His fingers brushed the broken half of the key in his pocket, cool, sharp, waiting. The lock on the door was thick, built into the steel itself. Its faceplate was engraved with the McLennan emblem, now scarred with rust. Half a keyhole. Half, like the one he held. He pressed the fragment in, twisting gently. It fit perfectly, but the turn jammed halfway. Of course, it needed the other piece. He cursed under his breath, glancing back toward the ladder. He was about to climb out when he noticed something odd. Condensation blooming on the metal door. Tiny beads of moisture, forming, then sliding down. He reached out. The steel was cold, but not dead cold. Warm, faintly, like the breath of something sleeping behind it. Then came the sound. A low hum. Mechanical. Old but alive. Harold stepped back, heart pounding. He raised the flashlight higher and froze. On the wall beside the door, nearly hidden beneath grime, was a faint red light. A sensor of some kind, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. He hadn't triggered it climbing down, so what had? Then he heard the second sound. Footsteps. Above. Slow. Heavy. Careful. Someone else had entered the mill. He doused the flashlight and pressed himself flat against the damp wall, the darkness folding around him like a second skin. The footsteps echoed across the floor above, measured, unhurried, then paused right above the hatch. Metal creaked. The hatch began to lift. Light spilled down the ladder, slicing the dark in narrow bars. Harold gripped the shotgun, every muscle taut. He could see the silhouette now, a broad frame, coat flaring with movement, a familiar tilt of the head. The scarred man. He descended the ladder slowly, one step at a time, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dust. Harold waited until the man's boots hit the floor. Then he stepped out from the shadows, voice low and steady. Looking for this. He held up the broken key. The man froze, eyes narrowing. That, he said quietly, belongs to me. Harold's finger tightened on the trigger. Not anymore. And for a heartbeat, the two men stood facing each other in the dark. The only light between them the red pulse of the door marked 03, beating like a warning. The air in the tunnel turned electric. For a moment neither man moved. Harold with the shotgun, the stranger with one hand half raised, his eyes glinting like metal in the dim red light. Easy now, the scarred man said softly. You don't even know what's behind that door. Maybe you should tell me, Harold shot back. The man's smile was thin, humorless. Your father never did. That stopped Harold cold. You knew him? I worked for him, the man said. Back when he was still moving crates for Daniel McLennan. You think your old man was just a farmer? He was the one who helped bury what the McLennans stole, and when they turned on each other, he made sure it stayed hidden. For a price. Harold's grip faltered slightly. You're lying. The man shrugged. You're standing on proof. He nodded toward the door marked 03. That's the last vault. The real one. The safe you bought. The map. The letters. Those were breadcrumbs. Your father scattered them in case he couldn't come back. Harold's throat went dry. Come back from what? The man's eyes flicked to the shotgun. You want answers? Put that down and help me open it. Then you'll see what your father died protecting. Harold hesitated. The story made no sense, yet it fit too neatly into the empty spaces his father had left behind. The sleepless nights, the secret walks to the river, the silence whenever the McLennan name was mentioned. He lowered the shotgun slightly, but kept his distance. You've got the other half of the key, don't you? The scarred man smiled, a small, victorious curve of his lips. From his pocket, he drew a jagged piece of metal, the twin of Harold's fragment. Been waiting 60 years for this, he murmured, stepping toward the lock. Harold's instinct screamed no, but the man had already pressed the two halves together, sliding them into the mechanism. The lock clicked. Once, twice. Then a slow, heavy groan rolled through the tunnel as the bolts slid free. The red light above the door turned green. A hiss of air escaped, cold and stale, the exhale of something sealed for half a century. The man smiled wider. Welcome to the McLennan legacy. He pulled the door open. Harold raised the flashlight, and what lay beyond made his blood run cold. Rows of shelves, stacked from floor to ceiling. Not with gold, not with money, with files. Thousands of them, each marked with a name. And one of them, nearest the door, read, Harold Jenkins. For a moment, Harold couldn't move. The tunnel's air pressed thick against his lungs, the smell of iron and mildew sharp as blood. Rows of file boxes stretched into darkness, their labels yellowed, curling, yet the ink still legible. The scarred man stepped past him, flashlights sweeping over the shelves. You see, he said quietly, this wasn't about money. The McLennans hid records. Every debt, every payoff, every deal that kept their empire alive. Harold swallowed hard. And my name? The man crouched beside the nearest stack, fingers tracing the spines. Your father's handwriting. He cataloged all of it. They made him the keeper. He lifted a file and flipped it open. Inside, ledgers, receipts, correspondence on faded letterhead. Names Harold recognized. Townsfolk, merchants, even the sheriff from back in the day. Blackmail. Control. This is how they ran everything, the stranger murmured. When the mill went under, Daniel McLennan ordered your father to destroy it. He didn't. He sealed it down here instead. Harold's stomach twisted. He was protecting them? The man looked up sharply. No, he was protecting you. He pointed to the file marked Harold Jenkins. Open it. Hands shaking, Harold pulled the folder free. Inside was a single envelope. No ledgers, no lists. Just a letter, brittle with age. Son, if you ever find this, don't let them take it. What's buried here could ruin more than names. Some debts never die. If they find you, they'll make you finish what I couldn't. Burn it all. The signature at the bottom was barely visible, smudged into the paper. Earl Jenkins. Harold's throat burned. His father hadn't been hiding gold. He'd been hiding truth. Behind him, the scarred man said softly, that's one way to read it. Harold turned. The man was holding something. A lighter, silver, engraved with the McLennan crest. Or, the stranger continued, we use it the way Daniel intended. Leverage. Names like these still mean money. And power. He flicked the lighter open. The flame hissed blue and hungry. Put that down, Harold warned. The man smiled. You really think he wanted it burned? The lighter snapped shut. He slid it into his pocket. No, Mr. Jenkins. Your father didn't die protecting secrets. He leaned closer, voice low. He died trying to buy his way out of them. Harold's grip on the shotgun tightened until his knuckles went white. The tunnel felt smaller now, the air closing in, walls sweating cold moisture. You're lying, he said quietly. My father wasn't like that. The scarred man chuckled, low, cruel. Oh, he was exactly like that. He took McLennan's money, took their trust, then ran when the deal went bad. You think he built that farm on honesty? He built it on this. He gestured toward the shelves. On silence. Harold's pulse roared in his ears. Then why come after me? Because silence doesn't last forever. The man stepped closer, voice soft but cutting. I was hired to clean up what your father couldn't bury deep enough. The shotgun came up between them. Stop. For a heartbeat, they stared each other down, two men bound by ghosts. Then the scarred man's smile vanished. He lunged. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beams spinning wildly as the two struggled in the half-dark. The blast from the shotgun shattered the air, deafening in the narrow tunnel. A spray of dust rained from the ceiling. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his coat. He laughed once, a sharp, breathless sound. Guess the old man taught you something after all. He stumbled toward the door, one hand groping for the lighter. Harold kicked it away, the metal skidding under a shelf. Don't, Harold shouted. But the man had already reached into his coat pocket and hurled something small, a flare. It hit the ground, sparking white-hot. In seconds, the dry papers nearest the floor caught fire. The flames leapt upward, licking the shelves, devouring ink and history. The man turned toward the ladder, dragging himself along the wall. You'll never know what he did, he hissed. None of us will. Harold grabbed the letter, shoved it inside his jacket, and ran for the hatch. Smoke filled his lungs, heat chasing him up the rungs as the tunnel below turned orange. By the time he reached the surface, the night sky was a whirl of smoke and flame. The old mill glowed from within like a furnace, its windows pulsing with light. The fire roared so loud it drowned his heartbeat. And somewhere below, buried in ash and history, the truth burned with it. By dawn, the mill was nothing but a blackened skeleton. The fire had burned through the night, turning metal to bone and concrete to dust. Harold sat on the tailgate of his truck, shirt torn, face smeared with soot. The air still reeked of smoke and river mud. Fire crews had come and gone, shaking their heads. Old place must have had oil in the walls, one of them said. Went up like kindling. No one asked why Harold Jenkins was sitting there at sunrise, eyes fixed on the ashes. They found no sign of the scarred man. The sheriff said maybe he'd escaped, maybe the river took him. But Harold knew better. He'd seen the tunnel collapse behind them, heard the roar, the way the earth had swallowed its secret hole. The files were gone. Every name, every lie, every truth his father had buried, turned to smoke. All except one thing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope he'd saved from the fire. The paper was scorched at the edges, but the handwriting was still there. His father's words stared back at him. If they find you, burn it all. He had. And yet, he didn't feel peace. Only emptiness. From his pocket, he drew the broken half of the key, warped now from heat, blackened but intact. He turned it in his hand, the metal still faintly warm. That key had opened a vault of ghosts. But it also locked one thing away forever, the truth about his father. The wind shifted, carrying embers across the river. They glowed briefly, then died, scattering into the current. Harold watched them drift downstream, whispering to no one, "It's done." But as he started the truck, the radio crackled, static, then a faint voice breaking through. Authorities investigating fire, second suspect unidentified, believed injured but at large. Harold's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He looked in the rearview mirror, the smoke rising, the mill reduced to ruin, and for just an instant, he thought he saw a movement near the trees. A silhouette, broad-shouldered, limping. The scarred man was still alive, and if he'd survived the fire, he wouldn't stop now. The days that followed blurred together, long hours of silence, fields gone unplowed, sleep that never came easy. Harold kept the shotgun propped beside the door, the half-melted key in a tin box under his bed. He told himself he wasn't waiting. But he was. The scarred man haunted every creak of the farmhouse, every shadow that stretched across the yard after sundown. By the third night, Harold started hearing things, faint tires on gravel, the scrape of boots outside. Each time he stepped out with the flashlight, there was nothing but wind and corn stalks bending in the dark. He'd stopped going to town. Too many questions about the fire, about that safe everyone keeps talking about. He'd lied easily, said he'd just been clearing old junk. But he could tell by the looks, by the way conversations died when he entered the store, that the story had spread. And then, just past midnight, came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. Not frantic, not polite, measured. He froze halfway down the hall, heart slamming. The sound came again. He stepped closer, slow, shotgun raised. Who is it? Silence. He peered through the side window. Nothing. The porch was empty. The fields beyond glowed pale under a thin moon. He unlatched the door an inch and listened. Something moved near the barn. A faint scrape. Metal on wood. He slipped outside, bare feet on the cold boards, the night air damp and heavy. The barn door was ajar. He was sure he'd locked it. Inside, the lantern swung gently from the beam, its flame guttering. The crate he'd brought from the river sat open on the floor, and on top of the tarp lay a single object that hadn't been there before. A key. Whole again. The two halves joined, edges fused smooth. Harold's pulse stopped for a beat. Pinned beneath it was a scrap of scorched paper torn from his father's letter. Scrawled across the margin, in fresh ink, were 5 words. You didn't burn it all. The lantern flickered once, then went out. From the darkness behind him came a whisper. Miss me, Jenkins? Harold spun, shotgun raised, but the voice had already melted back into the dark. Only silence, and the slow rasp of his own breathing. Show yourself, he barked, sweeping the light across the barn. The beam caught nothing but dust swirling in the air. Then, a shape at the far wall. The scarred man stepped out from behind the old tractor, coat hanging in tatters, one arm bound with a strip of burned cloth. His face was drawn, pale, but his grin still carried that same cruel ease. Hard to kill history, he said. Or me. Harold's finger tightened on the trigger. Stay where you are. I'm not here to fight. The man lifted his empty hand. We both lost what was down there. The fire took it, but there's still one thing left. He nodded toward the table, the reforged key glinting faintly in the dim light. Harold didn't answer. That door in the tunnel, the man went on. You saw the others, didn't you? 01, 02, 03. He stepped closer, voice low and deliberate. There's a 4th. Harold's stomach turned. You're lying. Am I? The man's eyes glimmered. Your father didn't just keep records. He kept proof. A backup, sealed away before he ran. And you still have his half of the key. Harold's glance flicked to the tin box on the shelf, the half-melted fragment he'd hidden. The man's gaze followed it. I don't want your farm, the stranger said. I don't even want you dead. I just want what he promised. Promised who? The man smiled faintly. The ones who paid for all this. He reached into his pocket and tossed something toward Harold's feet. A folded document, burned at the corners. It was an old contract, signed in looping ink, Earl Jenkins, and beneath it, Daniel McLennan. The signature dates were identical. A single clause stood out. In the event of loss or death, heirs shall assume custodial duty. Harold felt the weight of it hit him like a blow. He wasn't just his father's son. He was his replacement. The scarred man's voice softened, almost kind. So you see, Harold, you don't have a choice. You were written into the debt before you were even born. The key between them gleamed, a promise or a curse. And for the first time, Harold understood. This wasn't about what his father had hidden. It was about what he'd left behind. The barn felt smaller by the second, the air thick as syrup. Harold stared at the scarred man, the contract trembling in his hands. It wasn't just paper. It was a chain reaching across generations, binding him to a lie older than he'd ever guessed. You expect me to finish your game? Harold said, voice low. To open another vault, start all this again? The scarred man's grin widened. Not a game. A handoff. He lifted the whole key. The two halves fused clean, as if the fire had welded them together. Your father didn't destroy everything. He left me the rest. He walked slowly toward the barn doors, motioning with his head. Come on, Jenkins. The mill's gone, but the river still runs. You want answers? They're waiting. Harold hesitated only a heartbeat, then grabbed his coat and followed. The night had gone utterly still. No wind, no crickets, just the two of them crunching down the dirt road. The moon hung low, fat and yellow, casting their shadows long behind them. They reached the river bend where the first crate had been buried. The hole gaped open again. Someone had dug it deeper since Harold last came. Wood splinters jutted from the mud, and in the center yawned a narrow tunnel shored with fresh boards. You dug this? Harold asked. I found it, the man replied. Your father started it decades ago. Must have meant to come back. He dropped to one knee and pressed the key into a small iron door embedded at the tunnel's mouth, the same McLennan crest stamped in the steel. The lock turned smoothly, like it had been waiting. With a hiss, the door opened. Cold air spilled out, smelling of salt and stone. Inside lay a short staircase descending into flickering light. Not flame, Electricity. Someone had been here recently. The scarred man smiled back at him. After you. Harold raised the shotgun, but didn't fire. His boots met the first step, then the next. The air grew colder, cleaner, tinged with the hum of power. At the bottom, a cavern opened, rough stone walls, cables running like veins across them, leading to a vault door far larger than any he'd seen before. Painted across it in faded red letters was a single word: recompense. The scarred man's eyes gleamed in the dim light. This, he whispered, is what your father died trying to protect. The hum deepened as they stepped into the cavern, a low electrical drone vibrating through the soles of Harold's boots. Cables disappeared into the walls like black roots. A generator ticked somewhere unseen. This place wasn't ancient. It was alive. Maintained. The massive vault door looked less like something from a bank and more like a reactor seal. Layers of steel, bolts the size of fists, warning labels half erased by time. Harold swallowed hard. What is this? The scarred man approached the console beside the door, brushing away dust. His burned fingers tapped the keypad with familiarity. Daniel McLennan built this during the collapse. Said it was insurance, not for money, not for gold. He paused, eyes gleaming. For names. For power. The records you saw in Vault 03 were just paper. This, he gestured toward the door, is digital. The archive. The original files, scanned and stored before anyone could destroy them. Harold stared. You mean this still works? After all this time? The man smiled faintly. Your father made sure it would. He wired half this town's electricity through the old mill's line. Even now, it feeds here. The thought sent a cold tremor through Harold's chest. His father, the man who'd taught him to work the soil and keep his word, had been keeping the current of a buried empire alive. The scarred man slid the key into a terminal slot near the lock. The machine whirred, lights flickering to green. The bolts withdrew with a thunderous clank. Once we open it, he said, we end the debt. I get my share, and you, he nodded at Harold, get your father's redemption. Harold took a step back. You don't know what's in there. Oh, I do. The man's smile twisted. It's every secret this county ever buried. And you'll open it, Jenkins, because your name is the password. The console beeped. A voice, distorted and old, filled the chamber. State authorization code. The scarred man looked at Harold expectantly. Go on. Say it. Harold hesitated. The hum of the vault seemed to fill his skull, the generator's rhythm like a second heartbeat. And then, a faint sound above them. Footsteps. The man frowned. What was? Before he could finish, the vault lights flickered, and a deep metallic groan echoed through the cavern. Something else was inside. Something that had just moved. The groan swelled into a grinding roar as the vault door began to turn on its own, gears shrieking under unseen force. The scarred man stumbled backward, shouting, I didn't trigger it. The floor vibrated. Dust rained from the ceiling. Harold shielded his face as the door swung open, flooding the cavern with a pale, artificial light that burned away shadow. Inside was no pile of gold. No paper, no ledgers, no files. Just screens, dozens of them, stacked floor to ceiling, blinking with static and fragments of text. Old security footage flickered across some. Others scrolled names, numbers, transactions, decades of lives reduced to code. And in the center, seated behind a metal console, was a figure. A man, thin, pale, motionless. Or what was left of him. Skin drawn tight over bone, hands curled around a keyboard. A headset still clung to his skull, wires running from his spine into the machines. Harold's knees weakened. The face, even half preserved by the cold, was unmistakable. Dad, he whispered. The scarred man stepped forward, stunned. He's been here all this time. Harold barely heard him. He reached the console, trembling, fingers hovering over his father's frozen hands. The monitors nearest him flickered, lines of data rearranging themselves. A voice, faint but mechanical, rasped from the speakers. Earl Jenkins, custodian, system integrity maintained. Harold staggered back. The voice wasn't alive, it was an echo. His father's last work, still guarding the archive, still keeping the McLennan secrets sealed. The scarred man's jaw turned to greed. It's all here. Every file, every account. We can pull it. Harold turned, eyes hard. No, he wanted it buried. He slammed his fist against the console. Sparks burst from the panels. Alarms howled through the chamber. "What are you doing?" the scarred man shouted. "Finishing it." Harold grabbed the shotgun from the floor and fired into the generator. The explosion was instant. White light, heat, then a deafening roar as the power core ruptured. Flames leapt across the room, devouring the wires, swallowing the vault's heartbeat. The last thing Harold saw was his father's still face, lit by the dying glow of the screens, before the world dissolved into smoke and silence. Epilogue. 3 days later, search teams found nothing but a sinkhole where the river bend used to be. The papers said the collapse was natural erosion. Months passed before anyone noticed the small package left on the courthouse steps, a warped brass key, melted down the middle, wrapped in a single sheet of paper that read, "Debt paid." No one ever claimed it. But those who'd once carried the McLennan name began, one by one, to sell their land and leave town. And on clear nights, when the wind ran through the valley just right, the locals swore they could hear it, the low, steady hum of machines deep underground, still keeping the secrets of men who'd tried to own the world, and the sun who burned it all.